There's something peaceful about walking through these wide open spaces in the high desert. You find yourself lost in these fields of grasses and sage, lost in the views to the west, a tree line of juniper and ponderosa pine, and beyond that, the Cascade Mountains, Bachelor, Broken Top, and the Three Sisters. As the sun begins to set, the shadows grow longer and longer, the sky deepens, the temperatures begin to drop, and the horizon seems to catch fire. You'd be tempted to think that the high desert wilderness is amazing, except this isn't the wilderness. It's an open piece of land a few blocks from where I live, here in the King's Forest area of Bend. When I moved here 25 years ago, there was a lot of undeveloped desert land here, just like this, right within the city itself. But as you can see, here, like everywhere else, the land is under development. Within a year, it will be paved over with blacktop and will have a nice subdivision of McMansions, packed together like mortgages in a file cabinet. Or maybe a mini mall with an actual McDonald's, so I don't have to drive as far to get my Big Mac and fries. But this will all be gone, and as the years pass, you'll have to drive further and further out of town to find anything like it. The good news is, there's one thing that all the development in the world can't take away: these amazing Central Oregon skies. Because we're at the edge of the desert, clouds driven by winds from the east tend to stack up here against the Cascade Mountains, creating these amazing cloudscapes. As I talked about in episode 1, Stormy Skies over Bend, I love these high desert storms. In the summer, the clouds begin to form in the early afternoon, and by sunset, you can get some spectacular cloud formations, which can be both stunning and awe-inspiring. This is a photo I took last summer, late in the afternoon, as sunlight was fighting to break through this massive cloud wall that seems to just crush the horizon beneath it. These clouds are way darker than those stormy skies I painted before, more ominous, more threatening, and they will be the subject of my next painting, Dark Clouds over Bend. In episode 1, I talked about how I transfer the image to my sheet of masonite and do an underpainting to define areas of light and dark. When the surface is completely dry, I'm ready to paint. As always, I use a very simple palette. By mixing these three primary colors, cad red, cad yellow, and phthalo blue, I can create almost any color that exists. I use Portland gray light and Payne's gray for my neutral colors, burnt umber for my darks, and of course my standby titanium white. On hand are also my usual assortment of double aught and number 2 brushes, and my custom medium and odorless terps for mixing, thinning, and cleaning brushes. I begin, as I often do, with the lightest areas of the painting. In this case, I use almost pure titanium white and go in and start painting the bright areas of the clouds, defining and feathering edges as I go. Then, using burnt umber and gray, I'll add warm touches to the clouds near the bright areas. I'm not too worried about final detail at this point because I'm just getting started. Using this very warm, almost brown gray, I work my way around all of these holes in the clouds, creating a transition between the bright white edges and the areas that will become, eventually, very dark shadows. Then, adding just the slightest touch of cad red, I block in the sky, which will become the warmest part of the painting. Next is one of the fun parts, enhancing all the dark areas, the deepest shadows. Using a mix of burnt umber and Payne's gray, I use an almost dry brush technique with very little medium, so that the paint goes on in thin layers that I sort of sweep around the surface, following the contours of the clouds, defining their shapes. I can almost feel the sheer power within these clouds as I work on them, see the lightning strikes, hear the thunder that's going to shake the high desert during this coming storm. Note that when I'm painting in the dark areas here along the bottom of the clouds, I'm already thinking about how I'm going to paint these striking God rays of sunlight that streak across the lower layers toward the ground below. I'll add a light glaze later to enhance the light, but for now, defining these shadows is equally important. Then it's time to add a burst of pure color. One of the fun things about this painting is the way we see a hint of clear blue sky just beyond the clouds. This bright blue stands in stark contrast to the blacks and grays that surround it, creating a stunning effect. I use a mix of phthalo blue and Payne's gray for the deeper sky colors towards the top. Then, add titanium white as I work my way down the picture, so the blue gets progressively lighter and lighter as we near the horizon. Once all the masses of color are roughed in, I start on the detail work. I use a dark gray and begin to refine the edges of the clouds, leaving just these tiny strips of white. Here, I try to follow the photo source as closely as possible to capture the way the surface of the cloud looks as it bends away from us. I work my way around the entire painting, using the same warm gray to define edges and add detail. The key here is to work intuitively. There's no right or wrong. Sometimes I use the warm color to blend between lights and darks, sometimes it's just a splash of color here or there, and sometimes it provides a very thin edge to a contour. I just keep working at it until I get something that I like. For the last few details in the clouds, I use a bit of burnt sienna, again very sparingly, and mixed with Portland gray and white. This gives me a very warm color that provides great contrast with the deep blues and dark grays. Like I've been doing, I start working my way around the image, further refining edges, adding color to highlights, and more shape to large areas of color. Using the same color, I jump down to the horizon and begin to refine these small distant clouds, as well as the underside of this massive cloud wall. Adding medium so that the paint becomes a glaze, I go in and refine the God rays, working to blend and diffuse the bright streams of light while further separating areas of dark and shadow. If you compare my painting to its photo source, you'll see that I'm doing a lot of improvisation. I always say that copying the photo exactly is never the goal. I want to use it as a guide towards authenticity, but I won't be a slave to it. All these warm edges, for example, that I'm building up around these bright areas of cloud simply don't exist in the photo. They're merely suggested by those bright artifacts of light you see around the edges. I take that idea and enhance it, creating something that feels authentic but also painterly. It's small, creative choices like these that make the painting worth something. Anyone can churn out a copy, but it takes inspiration, technique, and a lot of sweat to make it your own unique expression. Finally, I grab a new double-op brush and begin to paint in the tree line. I've talked about this before, how you want to suggest trees and shrubs without getting mired down in too much detail. All it takes is a few small strokes, a few daubs of green and yellow along the horizon and in the foreground to suggest all this dense foliage. The trees and distant mountains are not the point of this painting. I want viewers to really focus on the sunlight trying to break through the clouds above. But this tiny bit of horizon is important because it adds a sense of scale to the entire scene. In the photo, which was taken along the Deschutes River, you can see some buildings off in the distance. Again, the great thing about painting is I can decide whether or not to include them. In this case, I decide no. I'd rather that these large blocky structures not intrude on my landscape, and I cut them all out. As always, the last thing I add is my signature. Again, I want patrons to be able to see it and read it, but I don't want it to be the first thing they see. So I carefully blend a darker version of the horizon color that will be visible but not obtrusive. And with that, the painting is done. I had a lot of fun with this painting and really like this palette, which has a combination of colors you just don't see that often in nature. I hope you enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed painting it. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this episode, please leave a comment and consider subscribing to my channel. See you next time.